5 moves. That's all it took to freeze the air in a glass-walled study overlooking the Silicon Valley skyline. 5 moves to turn a millionaire's mocking laughter into a hollow, suffocating silence. 5 moves to prove that the quiet girl sitting in the corner, the one the world only saw as the help's daughter, was actually the most dangerous mind in the room. But before we reached that moment, the moment Sarah Bryant made a play that would shatter a CEO's ego and rewrite her mother's future, we have to understand how a 12-year-old in a faded hoodie ended up sitting across from a man who thought he owned the world. We have to see how Henry Glover, a man who measured worth in billions, learned that genius doesn't always come in a 3-piece suit. This is a story about the invisibility of the working class, the fierce bond between a mother and daughter, and the devastating price of underestimating someone because of the color of their skin or the job that they do. Sarah Bryant lived her life in the margins of the Glover estate, while her mother, Denise, arrived at 6 a.m. to begin the endless cycle of scrubbing, polishing, and serving. Sarah followed like a silent shadow. She had learned early on that for girls like her, survival meant being small, being quiet, being invisible. But while Denise's hands were busy with bleach and microfiber, Sarah's mind was miles away, locked in a world of 64 squares. She didn't have an expensive marble set like the one in Henry's library. Her board was a piece of cardboard she'd marked herself, and her pieces were a collection of smoothed river stones and bottle caps she kept in an old cigar box. Every morning, while Denise prepped the executive breakfast, Sarah would sit on the back porch steps and play out matches from memory, games her grandfather had taught her before he passed. The way her eyes moved was different from other children. They didn't dart, they calculated. She didn't just see the world as it was. She saw it as a series of tactical variations. Every hallway Denise cleaned was a rank, every doorway a file. Henry Glover, the CEO of Glover Tech, treated the estate like a kingdom and the people in it like NPCs in a game he had already won. To him, Denise was a tool for comfort, and Sarah was merely background noise. He was a man who thrived on dominance, often hosting chess and cognac nights where he would crush junior VPs to remind them of the hierarchy. He played with a brutal, bullying style, using his wealth to intimidate and his status to distract. He never noticed the girl in the hoodie watching from the library doorway. He never noticed how her fingers twitched every time he made a sloppy, arrogant blunder with his knight. He never saw the fire in her eyes when he spoke down to her mother, calling her sweetheart with a bite of venom that made Denise's shoulders hunch. Sarah saw it all. She saw the exhaustion in her mother's eyes and the callousness in Henry's smile. She knew that in Henry's world, they were pawns. But her grandfather had taught her the most important lesson of all. A pawn is the only piece on the board that can transform into a queen, provided it has the courage to reach the other side. The silver-gray light of 6 a.m. never quite reached the corners of the Glover Estate's service entrance. But Sarah Bryant didn't need light to see the world. As her mother, Denise, swiped her biometric badge to unlock the heavy steel door, Sarah stepped inside with a practiced, silent grace. To the security cameras and the few early rising staff, she was just a small, dark shadow in a faded navy hoodie, the quiet girl who came and went without a word. But in Sarah's mind, the moment she crossed the threshold, the world transformed into a geometric battlefield. The foyer was a sprawling expanse of white Carrara marble, an $8 × grid if you looked closely at the vein patterns. She moved with a specific rhythm, skipping every third tile, her mind automatically calculating the knight's path from the door to the grand staircase. To anyone else, she was just a child avoiding cracks. To Sarah, she was a piece in play, navigating a board where the stakes were far higher than wood or plastic. While Denise moved immediately to the industrial-sized pantry to begin prepping the CEO's organic green juice and triple-shot espresso, Sarah retreated to her square. It was a cramped, windowless alcove behind the massive laundry room, a place where the hum of the dryers provided a constant, vibrating bass note. This was her sanctuary. From beneath a stack of folded linens, she pulled out her most prized possession, a piece of corrugated cardboard, flattened and hand-drawn with a Sharpie. The squares weren't perfectly even. Some were stained with drops of juice, others frayed at the edges where she had folded it 100 times to hide it from the estate manager's prying eyes. But to Sarah, it was more beautiful than the $20,000 marble set that sat untouched in Henry Glover's library. She reached into an old, beaten-up cigar box and pulled out her army. There were no hand-carved knights or weighted bishops here. Her king was a heavy brass nut she'd found in the garage. Her queen was a polished blue river stone. Her pawns were a mismatched collection of plastic bottle caps, red for her, white for the imaginary opponent. She sat cross-legged on the cold linoleum, her eyes narrowing as she set the board. She wasn't just playing a game, she was practicing mental mapping, a technique her grandfather had taught her in the cramped apartment they'd shared before he died. "The board isn't on the table, Sarah," he used to whisper, his voice thick with the gravel of 1,000 cigarettes. "The board is in the air. It's in the ceiling. It's in your blood. If you can see the move before your hand even twitches, you own the room." As the scent of expensive coffee began to waft through the vents, Sarah closed her eyes. She didn't need to look at the cardboard anymore. In the darkness behind her eyelids, a translucent board shimmered into existence. She moved the blue stone to $4 in her mind. She anticipated the response. She saw the lines of force radiating from the center, the invisible threads of tension connecting every piece. The sound of a heavy door slamming upstairs broke her concentration. That was the signal. Henry Glover was awake. Sarah quickly folded her board and tucked her stones back into the cigar box, sliding them deep into the shadows. She stood and walked toward the kitchen, pausing at the heavy swinging door that separated the service world from the executive world. Through the narrow glass pane, she saw her mother. Denise was standing at the granite island, her back straight but her shoulders tight with a tension she only wore here. Denise was 33, but in the harsh, recessed lighting of the Glover kitchen, she looked 10 years older. Her hands, usually so gentle when she braided Sarah's hair, were red and raw from the constant contact with industrial cleaners. Sarah watched as Henry Glover entered the kitchen. He was a man who didn't walk so much as he occupied space, his presence pushing the air out of the room. He was dressed in a silk robe that cost more than Denise made in a month, his eyes glued to a tablet as he barked orders about his morning schedule. He didn't look at Denise as she handed him his coffee. He didn't thank her. He treated her like a clever appliance, something that functioned perfectly and therefore required no acknowledgement. "The library floor is streaked, Denise," Henry muttered, not looking up from his screen. "Ensure it's buffed before the guests arrive for the fundraiser tonight. And keep the kid out of the way. I don't want people tripping over her while they are trying to talk business." Denise's jaw tightened, a tiny tremor in her hand as she wiped the counter. "Yes, Mr. Glover. She'll stay in the back." Sarah felt a cold, sharp spark ignite in her chest. It was a sensation she usually saved for the endgame, the moment when she realized her opponent had left a weakness she could exploit. She looked at Henry, really looked at him, and performed a different kind of mental mapping. She didn't see a CEO. She saw a king that had overextended his reach. He was arrogant. He was shielded by pawns he didn't value. He was playing a game he thought he'd already won because he didn't think anyone else on the board was worth watching. She retreated back to her alcove, the hum of the dryers sounding like a war drum in her ears. She pulled out the cardboard again, but this time she didn't set up a standard opening. She placed the brass nut, the king, in the center of the board, completely surrounded by her bottle-cap pawns. "You don't even see us," she whispered to the empty room, her voice a low, steady promise. She began to move the pieces with a terrifying, calculated speed. Her fingers, small and nimble, danced over the cardboard. She wasn't playing a game of leisure. She was rehearsing a revolution. She visualized the grand library upstairs, the mahogany table, and the expensive marble set. She saw the moves Henry would make, aggressive, flashy, designed to intimidate rather than to win. And then she saw the 5 moves that would end him. The shadow girl wasn't just hiding in the corners anymore. She was waiting. And on this board, the smallest piece was about to become the most dangerous thing in the house. The grand library of the Glover estate was less a room for reading and more a monument to conquest. High, vaulted ceilings of dark walnut trapped the scent of expensive tobacco and aged scotch, while the walls were lined with leather-bound books that Henry Glover had likely never opened, their gold-leaf spines gleaming under the soft glow of recessed halogen lights. In the center of this cathedral of ego sat the mahogany chess table, its surface polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the 2 men poised over it like predators in a glass cage. Henry Glover leaned back in his oversized leather chair, the silk of his designer shirt catching the light as he swirled a crystal tumbler of amber liquid. Across from him sat Julian Vane, a venture capitalist who had made the mistake of thinking a business merger entitled him to a friendly game. Julian was sweating, his tie loosened, his eyes darting frantically across the board where his defensive line was being systematically dismantled. "You're thinking in 2 dimensions, Julian," Henry said, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr that filled the silent room. "That's your problem. You play chess like you manage your portfolio, fearfully. You're so worried about losing your rook that you've failed to see I've already cordoned off your king." Henry reached out, his hand steady and manicured, and slid his bishop across the marble board with a definitive clack. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Check. And in 3 moves, it's a funeral." Julian wiped his brow, leaning over the board until his face was inches from the pieces. "I can move the knight to f6. I can still block." Henry let out a short, barking laugh that carried no warmth. It was the sound of a man who found the struggle of others mildly entertaining, like watching an insect hit a window pane. Go ahead. Move the knight. It's a decorative gesture, at best. You're reacting to the ghost of a threat I made 10 minutes ago, while the real execution is already behind you. This is why your firm is stagnating, Julian. You lack the stomach for the blood work. You want the win, but you're terrified of the gamble. From the darkened hallway just beyond the library's arched entrance, Sarah Bryant stood as still as a statue. She held a tray of crystal carafes, her small hands steady despite the cold weight. She wasn't supposed to be seen. She was supposed to wait for the signal to refresh the water, but she was transfixed. From her vantage point, she didn't see two powerful men. She saw a board in disarray. Henry was playing the hill, a psychological tactic her grandfather had warned her about. He wasn't playing the best moves. He was playing the moves that caused the most emotional distress. He was leaving openings that looked like mistakes just to bait Julian into traps born of greed. It was an arrogant, sloppy style of play that relied entirely on the opponent being too intimidated to think clearly. I resign, Julian finally stammered, toppling his king with a trembling finger. You're right, Henry. Your foresight it's uncanny. Henry didn't offer a polite good game. He didn't even stand to shake the man's hand. He simply took a slow sip of his scotch, his eyes fixed on the board with a look of bored superiority. It's not foresight, Julian. It's simply being the only person in the room who knows what the room is for. Most people are just visitors in their own lives. I'm the architect. He looked up then, his gaze snapping toward the hallway, catching the glint of the silver tray Sarah was holding. His expression shifted from triumph to a flick of annoyance, as if a stray hair had landed on his sleeve. Girl, don't just stand there like a gargoyle. The water is room temperature. Replace it. And tell your mother the hors d'oeuvres for the fundraiser need to be plated by 7, not 7:15. Precision is not a suggestion in this house. Sarah stepped into the light, her face a mask of practiced neutrality. She walked to the table, her eyes instinctively scanning the final position of the pieces before she reached for the carafe. Is there something you want to say? Henry asked, leaning forward, his shadow falling across the board. He caught the way her eyes lingered on the marble squares. Do the pretty carved pieces confuse you? Or are you just wondering why people spend more on a hobby than your mother makes in a year? Sarah didn't look up. She kept her focus on the mahogany surface, noticing a smudge of Julian's sweat near the edge. No, sir, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Good, Henry snapped, turning back to his tablet. Because the world is divided into those who move the pieces and those who clean them. Make sure you remember which one you are before you overstay your welcome in my library. As Sarah turned to leave, her mind did what it always did. It ran the simulation. She saw the board as it had been 2 moves before Julian resigned. She saw the gaping hole in Henry's defense that Julian had been too scared to notice. If the knight had moved to d5 instead of f6, Henry's aggressive queen would have been trapped, forced into a trade that would have left him crippled. Henry Glover wasn't a master, she realized. He was a bully who had never been punched back. He played like a man who believed the rules were beneath him, leaving his flanks exposed to anyone with the clarity to see past his noise. She walked back toward the kitchen, the silver tray vibrating slightly in her grip. Behind her, she heard the heavy thud of Henry resetting the board, the sound of the king being slammed back into its starting square. He thought he was the master of the house, the architect of every outcome. But as Sarah passed through the swinging doors into the scent of lemon oil and industrial soap, she felt a strange, cold calm. She had seen the king's throat, and she knew exactly how many moves it would take to reach it. The humidity of the gala evening clung to the air, thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the heavy, metallic tang of silver polish. Inside the Glover ballroom, the elite of the valley moved in a sea of silk and hushed conversations, their laughter tinkling like ice in crystal. Denise had been on her feet for 14 hours. Her back was a dull roar of pain, and her vision was beginning to blur at the edges, the frantic pace of the fundraiser pushing her to the brink of exhaustion. Sarah watched from the shadows of the service corridor, her heart tightening every time she saw her mother stumble slightly while carrying a heavy tray of champagne flutes. The incident happened in a heartbeat. As Denise pivoted to avoid a boisterous venture capitalist, her heel caught on the edge of a thick Persian rug. The tray tilted. A single flute, just 1 out of 20, wobbled and tipped. It didn't shatter on the floor. It fell directly onto the sleeve of Henry Glover's charcoal gray Italian suit. The room went silent. The laughter died in throats as the cold liquid soaked into the fabric. Denise's face went a ghostly shade of gray, her hands shaking as she pulled a linen napkin from her belt. "I am so sorry, Mr. Glover. Let me. I can get that out immediately. Henry didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply looked down at his sleeve with a cold, detached disgust, as if he had just been touched by something diseased. When he finally looked up, his eyes were twin chips of ice. He didn't just look angry. He looked offended that a person he considered a utility had dared to be imperfect. "Do you have any idea what this suit costs, Denise?" His voice was low, but it carried to the farthest corners of the silent room. "It costs more than your daughter's education. It costs more than the roof over your head. And yet, you handle it with the grace of a farm animal." "I'm so sorry, sir," Denise whispered, her voice cracking as she began to dab at the sleeve. Henry swiped her hand away with a violent motion. "Stop. You've done enough damage with those clumsy hands." He turned to the crowd, a cruel, performative smirk beginning to spread across his face. He loved an audience, and he loved a victim even more. He walked over to the mahogany chess table that had been set up for the night's entertainment, his eyes landing on Sarah, who had stepped out from the corridor, her face set in a mask of cold fury. "Look at her." Henry gestured towards Sarah with his wet sleeve. "The little shadow, always watching. Tell me, Denise, does she have any more brains than you? Or is she just destined to spend her life scrubbing the floors I walk on?" A few of the guests chuckled nervously, emboldened by Henry's power. "She's very smart, Mr. Glover," Denise said, her voice trembling but defensive. "She's a genius at chess. She's better than anyone I've ever seen." Henry threw his head back and laughed, a loud, booming sound that felt like a physical blow. A genius. At chess. In that hoodie. He looked at Sarah, his lip curling. The world isn't a fairy tale, Denise. People like you don't produce geniuses. You produce labor. But tell you what, since you're so confident in your little prodigy, let's make a wager. It'll give my guests something to talk about. He leaned against the chess table, his fingers tapping the head of the marble king. If this girl can actually beat me, not just play, but beat me, I'll do more than forgive the suit. I'll give you a settlement that would let you retire tomorrow. Hell, I'm so sure she's a fraud that I'll go one step further. Beat me in chess, and I'll marry your mother. I'll make her the queen of this house instead of the woman who scrubs its toilets. The room erupted in mocking laughter. The cruelty of the joke was the point. It was a way to remind everyone in the room that Denise and Sarah were so far beneath him that the very idea of equality was a punchline. Think about it, Denise, Henry continued, his voice dripping with condescension. One game. Your daughter's genius against a man who actually knows how to run a world. Or are you going to admit that you're both exactly what you look like? Sarah felt the heat rising in her neck, a searing, white-hot focus that pushed out the noise of the crowd. She looked at her mother's slumped shoulders, the way Denise was staring at the floor in utter humiliation, the wet napkin still clutched in her hand. Sarah saw the bottle-cap pawns on her cardboard board in the laundry room. She saw her grandfather's face. And then she looked at Henry Glover, seeing the arrogant tilt of his head and the fatal gap in his character that he had just exposed to the entire room. 5 moves, Sarah said. The laughter stopped. Henry squinted, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. What did you say, kid? Sarah stepped forward, her voice no longer a whisper. It was steady, resonant, and carried the weight of a death sentence. I don't need a whole game. If I can't put you in checkmate in 5 moves, we'll leave this house tonight and never come back. But if I do... She paused, her eyes locking onto his with a terrifying intensity. If I do, you sign the papers. You pay for my mother's school. You give her the life you just joked about. Henry stared at her, his ego momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity of a 12-year-old in a hoodie. But the eyes of the valley's most powerful people were on him. He couldn't back down from a child. 5 moves. Henry sneered, resetting the board with a violent sweep of his hand. Fine. You want to play for high stakes, little shadow. Let's play. But when you lose, and you will lose, I want you both out of my sight before the sun comes up. He sat down at the table, the marble pieces gleaming under the chandeliers. He thought he was inviting a victim to a slaughter. He didn't realize he had just invited a master to a trap that had been set years ago on a piece of corrugated cardboard. Sarah sat across from him, her small hands resting on the edge of the mahogany, her mind already 3 moves past the end of his life as he knew it. The silence in the ballroom was no longer the comfortable, expectant quiet of a theater audience. It had become something jagged and pressurized. Henry Glover remained seated, his fingers draped over the edge of the mahogany table, his face a study in frozen disbelief. He had spent his entire life mastering the art of the monologue, ensuring that every person in his orbit was merely a prop for his brilliance. Now, a 12-year-old girl in a worn-out hoodie had not only interrupted him, but had rewritten the rules of his own game. "Sign it," Sarah said. Her voice didn't shake. It was a flat, tonal demand that cut through the residual whispers of the crowd like a razor. Henry blinked, a slow, deliberate movement as his brain scrambled to reclaim the high ground. "Sign what, exactly? The imaginary contract for your imaginary victory? Don't be absurd, kid. The joke is over. Go back to the laundry room and help your mother count the silverware." But Sarah didn't move. She reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, a standard estate liability form she had scavenged from the service desk earlier that week. On the back, in precise, architectural print, she had already drafted the terms. "The wager," Sarah said, sliding the paper across the polished wood until it rested against Henry's hand. "You said if I beat you, you'd marry my mother. You said you'd give her a settlement. You said it in front of 100 witnesses and 4 active live stream cameras." She pointed a small, steady finger toward the back of the room, where a social media influencer was holding a gimbal-mounted phone, the red live light glowing like a malevolent eye. "In this state, a verbal contract made in a public forum with intent to bind is enforceable. But I want it in ink." A low murmur rippled through the room. Julian Vane, the venture capitalist Henry had humiliated only an hour prior, stepped forward, a strange, hungry glint in his eyes. He leaned over Henry's shoulder, squinting at the paper. "She's right, Henry. You made the offer. You set the stakes. And you did it with quite a bit of theatricality." Henry felt the sweat begin to prickle at his hairline. He looked at the paper, then at the girl. He saw the way she stood, feet shoulder-width apart, eyes tracking his every micro-expression. She wasn't looking at him as a child looks at an adult. She was looking at him the way a Grandmaster looks at a crumbling defensive line. "This is ridiculous," Henry hissed, though his hand instinctively reached for the $800 fountain pen in his breast pocket. "You're a child. You don't have the legal standing to." "My mother does," Sarah interrupted. She turned to Denise, who was standing paralyzed by the buffet table. "Mom, come here." Denise approached as if walking through a dream, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a blooming, fragile hope she hadn't felt in a decade. She looked at the paper, then at the daughter she had tried so hard to keep invisible. She saw the steel in Sarah's spine, the same steel that had been in her grandfather's. "Sign it, Denise," Julian Vane urged, his voice carrying a jagged edge of spite. "Let's see if the master of the house is a man of his word, or if he's just a loudmouth with a fancy suit." The social pressure in the room was now a physical weight. Henry was a man who traded on his reputation for being all in. His entire brand was built on the premise that he never blinked, never backed down, and always held the winning hand. To refuse now, in front of his peers and a live digital audience, would be a confession of cowardice. It would be an admission that he was afraid of a 12-year-old girl. "Fine," Henry spat, the word tasting like bile. "You want a contract? I'll give you a contract. But understand this. When I crush you in 5 moves, not the other way around, the settlement will be your mother's immediate termination without a severance, and a blacklist that will ensure she never so much as mops a floor in this zip code again. Do we have a deal?" Deal, Sarah said instantly. Henry grabbed the pen. With a violent, sweeping motion, he scrawled his signature across the bottom of the paper. It was a jagged, aggressive mark, the signature of a man signing a death warrant. He shoved the pen toward Denise, who signed her name with a trembling hand, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. As the ink dried, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted. It was no longer a party, it was an arena. The guests moved closer, forming a tight, suffocating circle around the mahogany table. The influencer moved her camera to a top-down angle, capturing the marble pieces in their starting positions. Henry sat down, his movements sharp and performative. He adjusted his soaked sleeve, his ego rebounding as he looked at the board. He had played thousands of games. He knew every opening, every gambit, every trick in the book. He looked at the small girl across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and he felt a surge of predatory confidence. "White starts," Henry said, his fingers hovering over his king's pawn. "And since I'm a gentleman, I'll let you have the first move. Give me your best shot, little shadow. Let's see if that cardboard board taught you anything other than how to lose." Sarah didn't hesitate. She didn't look at the crowd, and she didn't look at the cameras. She looked through the marble pieces, through the table, and into the geometry of the next 10 minutes. Her hand reached out, her fingers as steady as a surgeon's, and she moved her first pawn. The pawn spoke, but it was Sarah's mind that roared. The trap was no longer a dream in a laundry room. It was live, and as the first move landed with a soft, hollow thud on the wood, the room realized that the girl in the hoodie wasn't playing for a win. She was playing for an execution. The air in the Glover ballroom was climate-controlled and sterile, but as Sarah stared at the board, she could almost smell the damp earth and diesel exhaust of Washington Square Park. In her mind, the polished mahogany table dissolved, replaced by the splintered, green-painted wood of a park bench. Across from her sat a man whose hands were not manicured like Henry's, but stained with tobacco and oil, his fingernails chipped from a lifetime of manual work. Her grandfather, Elijah, had been a man of few words and infinite patience. He had been a hustler in the eyes of the city, a man who played for $5 a game against tourists and NYU students. But to Sarah, he was a king in exile. He had taught her that the board was a mirror. If you looked closely enough, you didn't see pieces. You saw the soul of the person sitting across from you. "Look at his eyes, Sarah," Elijah had whispered one humid July afternoon, the sound of a nearby saxophone player drifting through the trees. "Don't look at his hands. His hands will lie to you. They'll make a move that looks strong, but his eyes will tell you if he's afraid. Most men play chess to prove they are smart. That's their first mistake. You play chess to prove they are human." He had reached out with a trembling hand and moved a battered wooden pawn, setting up a specific, deceptive formation. "This is the underdog's gambit," he said, his voice a low gravel. "It's a trap designed for the arrogant. A man like that CEO you see on the news, or the bankers who walk past us every day. They think they are entitled to the center of the board. They think because they have the bigger title, they have the better mind. They'll rush in, Sarah. They'll try to crush you early because they don't think you're worth the time it takes to be careful. He showed her the sequence then, the 5-move execution. It wasn't a standard opening found in the Grandmaster books. It was a street fighter's move, a series of seemingly weak, retreating steps that lured the opponent into a false sense of total dominance. It relied entirely on the opponent's desire to humiliate. By move 3, the trap would look like a blunder. By move 4, the opponent would be smiling. And move 5, Sarah had asked, leaning in until her forehead nearly touched his. Move 5 is the reckoning, Elijah said, a rare, sharp glint appearing in his clouded eyes. That's when you show them that the person they ignored is the one who holds their life in her hands. You don't just take their king, Sarah. You take their pride. You make them realize that the help was the master all along. He had made her play the sequence 1,000 times. He would shout at her, mimic the condescending laughter of a rich man, try to rattle her focus. He told her that as a young black girl in a world that would try to categorize her before she even spoke, her silence was her greatest weapon. Let them talk, he'd say. Let them laugh. Let them think you're struggling. Because while they are busy performing, you're calculating. You're mapping the end before they've even realized the game has started. Back in the ballroom, the memory of his voice acted as an anchor, steadying her pulse against the suffocating heat of the crowd. She looked at Henry Glover, who was currently leaning back, whispering a joke to a colleague and radiating an aura of bored invincibility. He was exactly the man Elijah had warned her about, a man blinded by the glare of his own shadow. Sarah felt a phantom hand on her shoulder, the rough, warm weight of her grandfather's palm. She realized then that she wasn't just playing for her mother's freedom or her own future. She was playing for Elijah, and for every person who had ever been looked over, talked down to, or dismissed as labor. She was the vessel for a century of hidden brilliance, a legacy of street corner grandmasters who never had a boardroom but understood the soul of the game better than any CEO ever could. She looked at the marble pieces. They were cold and expensive, but they moved the same way as her grandfather's chipped wooden set. The geometry was universal. The arrogance of the powerful was a constant. "Your move, Henry," she whispered, though the name felt small and insignificant. As he reached out to move his bishop, mirroring the exact aggressive blunder her grandfather had predicted years ago, Sarah felt a calm, cold clarity wash over her. The 5-move trap wasn't just a tactic anymore. It was a bridge. It was the way she would carry her mother out of the shadows and into the light. She could almost see Elijah sitting on the edge of the mahogany table, nodding slowly, his phantom cigarette smoke curling in the air. "Don't just take the king, Sarah. Take the room." She reached out, her fingers closing around her knight. The first move of the execution had begun. The ghost of the park bench was now the master of the estate. The 7 days that followed the signing of the contract were characterized by a silence so profound it felt like the breath before a storm. To Henry Glover, the wager was already a forgotten footnote, a momentary diversion he had used to exert his dominance. He went back to his meetings, his galas, and his relentless pursuit of profit, barely glancing at the girl who still lingered in the corners of his estate. But to Sarah, those 7 days were an intensive laboratory. She was no longer just the maid's daughter. She was a predator studying the gait of her prey. Every afternoon, while Denise scrubbed the limestone tiles of the indoor pool or steamed the heavy velvet drapes in the media room, Sarah positioned herself in the high-backed shadows of the library balcony. From there, she had a bird's-eye view of the mahogany table where Henry played his power matches against colleagues and rivals. She didn't have a notebook. That would be too visible. Instead, she used the mental architecture her grandfather had built within her. She recorded every flinch of his jaw, every arrogant flourish of his hand, and every recurring pattern in his strategy. By day 3, she had identified his rhythm. Henry Glover didn't play chess to achieve a beautiful position. He played to make his opponent feel small. He favored the wayward queen attack and aggressive, early pawn pushes. He loved to bring his most powerful pieces out into the center of the board immediately, a tactical display of shock and/or designed to rattle the amateur players he usually faced. He relied on the fact that most people were too intimidated by his status to punish his overextensions. By day 5, she found the crack in his armor. It was a subtle, ego-driven flaw buried deep within his opening gambit. Henry had a psychological blind spot. He could not imagine a scenario where a lesser piece could threaten his glory. Whenever an opponent offered a trade, a knight for a knight, or a bishop for a bishop, Henry would refuse it with a smirk, viewing a trade as a sign of equality he wasn't willing to acknowledge. He wanted to keep all his officers on the board to oversee the slaughter. He was so obsessed with the aesthetics of his own power that he left his back rank porous, a king standing in a palace with no rear doors. Sarah sat in her laundry room alcove late that night, her hand-drawn cardboard board laid out before her. She placed the blue river stone, her queen, and the brass nut that represented Henry. She ran the simulation again. If she moved her knight to c6, Henry would almost certainly respond with an aggressive bishop pin. If she then played the weak retreating move her grandfather had taught her, Henry's narcissism would do the rest of the work for her. He wouldn't see the trap. He would only see a child who was afraid. The silence of the house was broken only by the rhythmic thumping of the industrial dryer, a sound Sarah now used to time her mental moves. Tick, move, tack, counter-move. She saw it clearly now. The 5-move execution wasn't just a sequence of moves. It was a mirror that would reflect Henry's own arrogance back at him until it cut him. On the 6th day, Henry noticed her watching from the balcony. He was in the middle of a game with his chief technology officer, whom he was currently berating for a lack of vision. He looked up, catching Sarah's steady, unblinking gaze. For a split second, a flicker of something like unease crossed his face, a brief recognition that the shadow girl wasn't looking at the board with wonder, but with an icy, analytical detachment. Still dreaming of your 5 moves, kid? Henry shouted up to her, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Enjoy the view while it lasts. Tomorrow morning, you and your mother are out on the street. I've already contacted the agency to have her replaced. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She simply leaned over the railing, her face half submerged in the darkness. You shouldn't have moved your rook to h4, Mr. Glover, she said, her voice a calm, chilling whisper that seemed to carry through the massive room. You just lost your protection on the diagonal. Henry scoffed and turned back to the board, but his hand hesitated for a fraction of a second before he touched his piece. He dismissed her comment as a lucky guess, a child's attempt at bravado. He didn't see that she had just tested his reaction speed. He didn't see that she had already solved him. The final night was the quietest of all. Denise sat on the edge of her small twin bed in the staff quarters, her hands trembling as she smoothed out Sarah's only clean hoodie. "We can just leave tonight, Sarah," Denise whispered. "We don't have to go through with this. He's going to humiliate us in front of everyone." Sarah walked over and took her mother's hand. The skin was rough and smelled of lemon-scented bleach, a scent that had defined Sarah's entire childhood. "He's not going to humiliate us, Mom," Sarah said, her voice sounding older than her 12 years. "He's already lost. He just hasn't realized it yet. Tomorrow, you're never going to have to touch a bottle of bleach again. I promise." Sarah went to sleep that night not with fear, but with the absolute certainty of a mathematician who has reached the final line of a complex proof. The week of silence was over. The mapping was complete. The 5 moves were no longer a theory, they were an inevitability. As she closed her eyes, she didn't see the Glover estate or the looming threat of homelessness. She saw 6 to 4 squares, and a king with nowhere left to run. The night of the final board felt less like a charity gala and more like a public execution, though the crowd had yet to realize who was holding the blade. The ballroom was packed with the elite of the city, men in charcoal wool and women draped in silk, all forming a tight, expectant ring around the mahogany table. At the center of the orbit sat Henry Glover, his soaked sleeve replaced by a fresh, crisp shirt, his posture radiating a bored, predatory confidence. He checked his watch, a gold and platinum piece that cost more than a year of Denise's wages, and looked up as Sarah approached the table. She was still wearing the same navy hoodie, her hands buried in the front pocket, her face as unreadable as a stone wall. Behind her, Denise stood with her hands clasped tightly, her knuckles white, looking like a woman waiting for a verdict she already feared. The social media influencer from the week before was positioned perfectly, her lens focused on the marble pieces that glowed like polished bone under the chandeliers. "Are we ready to conclude this little fantasy, Sarah?" Henry asked, his voice booming for the benefit of the surrounding guests. He didn't wait for an answer. He reached out and slid his king's pawn forward to $E4 with a theatrical flourish. "The clock is ticking. You have 5 moves to change your life, or 5 moves to pack your bags. I suggest you make them count." Sarah didn't hesitate. She sat, her small frame nearly swallowed by the oversized leather chair, and mirrored his move, placing her pawn at $E5. Her touch was light, almost reverent. "Playing it safe." Henry chuckled, glancing at Julian Vane with a wink. The standard response. Predictable. On move 2, Henry brought his queen out early to $H5, the classic bully's opening, the wayward queen. It was an insult in the world of high-level chess, a move designed to embarrass children and beginners. A ripple of snickering went through the room. "I told you, Denise," Henry said, leaning back. "Intelligence isn't inherited. It's earned. And your daughter is playing checkers while I'm playing God." Sarah's response was immediate. She moved her knight to $C6. It looked like a standard defensive posture, the kind of move a panicked novice makes when they see a queen charging their lines. Henry laughed then, a rich, mocking sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Still defending? You're running out of time, little shadow. Move 3. He slid his bishop to $C4, setting up the scholar's mate, the most basic trap in the game. It was his final act of condescension, a move that screamed he didn't think she was worth a real strategy. He looked around at his peers, basking in their amused murmurs. I'll have the security team meet you at the service entrance in 10 minutes. I believe there's some trash that needs taking out. He expected her to flinch. He expected her to move her other knight or a pawn to block the mate. But Sarah didn't block. She didn't defend. Instead, she moved her knight to $F4. The move looked like a colossal blunder. It left her king's pawn completely undefended, practically inviting Henry's queen to take it and move into a crushing position. Henry's eyes lit up with a cruel, triumphant fire. That's it. That's the genius move. He reached for his queen, his fingers trembling slightly with the rush of the kill. You just gave me the game, kid. You just gave me everything. He slammed his queen down on $E5, checkmating, or so he thought, her central position. He looked up, ready to deliver the final insult, but the words died in his throat. The room had gone deathly quiet. Julian Vane was leaning forward, his eyes widening as he stared at the board. The laughter had vanished, replaced by a sudden, jagged tension. Sarah hadn't moved. She was looking at Henry, and for the first time, she wasn't the shadow girl. She was the architect. Move 4, Sarah whispered. She reached out and moved her queen to $G5. It was a silent, lethal slide. Suddenly, Henry's aggressive queen was no longer the hunter. She was the hunted. But more importantly, the square at $G2 was now under direct fire. Henry's eyes darted across the board, his brain finally beginning to calculate at the speed of a man who realized he was standing on a trapdoor. If he took her knight, he'd lose his queen. If he moved his queen to safety, he'd lose his rook. But as he looked deeper, he saw the real horror. The knight at $F4 wasn't a mistake. It was a spear directed at the very heart of his palace. The trap didn't just snap shut, it shattered his entire reality. Henry's face went from a flush of victory to a sickly, pale gray. The gold watch on his wrist felt heavy, a tether dragging him down. He looked at the girl in the hoodie, and he didn't see a child. He saw the 5-move execution his ego had blinded him to. Your move, Mr. Glover, Sarah said, her voice cutting through the silence like a cold wind. You have 1 move left to save your king. And I think we both know there isn't a square on this board that will have you. The master of the house looked down at the marble pieces, and for the first time in his life, he saw the truth. He wasn't the one moving the pieces. He was the one being played. And move 5 was coming for his soul. The silence in the ballroom was no longer empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and charged with the electricity of a collapsing empire. Henry Glover's hand hovered over the board, his fingers twitching as if they had forgotten how to grasp the marble. He looked at his queen, then at the knight Sarah had placed with such devastating precision, and finally at the girl herself. The mocking smirk that had been his permanent mask for decades had vanished, replaced by the hollow, slack-jawed expression of a man realizing he was standing on a dissolving bridge. "Well," Sarah's voice was a soft, rhythmic pulse in the stillness. "Move 5, Mr. Glover. The clock is still ticking." Henry's eyes darted frantically across the squares. He was looking for an exit, a loophole, a hidden variation that would allow his ego to survive the night. If he moved his queen to defend the G2 square, her knight would leap to H3, delivering a double check that would strip him of his most powerful piece. If he tried to run with his king, his entire defensive structure would crumble into a pile of expensive dust. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, lured there by a child he had dismissed as a background prop. I can't," Henry stammered, his voice cracking, the sound of a god discovering he was mortal. "You can't move because you've already lost," Sarah said. She reached out, her hand as steady as a mountain, and moved her queen to the final square of the execution, G2. The sound of the marble hitting the mahogany was the final gavel strike. "Checkmate," she whispered. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, Julian Vane let out a breath that sounded like a whistle. 5 moves, he murmured, his voice rising in awe. She actually did it. She dismantled him in 5 moves. The room erupted. It wasn't the polite, muffled applause of a gala. It was a roar of realization. The social media influencer was practically vibrating, her camera capturing the top-down view of the board, a geometric masterpiece of a Street Fighter's trap. The millionaires and titans of industry pushed forward, no longer looking at Sarah as the maid's daughter, but as something far more formidable. They were looking at a prodigy who had just performed a public vivisection of their most arrogant peer. Henry slumped back into his leather chair, the air leaving his lungs in a ragged hiss. He looked at the contract sitting next to the board, the ink of his signature staring back at him like an indictment. He had signed it as a joke, a cruel way to twist the knife in Denise's heart, never imagining for a second that the law, or the board, would hold him to it. But the cameras had seen it. The world had seen it. His reputation, his brand of invincibility, and his iron-fisted control over the people in his life had been shattered by a 12-year-old in a hoodie. "You're a fraud, Henry," Julian Vane said, his voice dripping with a satisfaction he had waited years to taste. "You spent all this time telling us how you were the architect of the room. It turns out you were just a squatter in a house built by someone else's genius." Sarah didn't join in the mockery. She didn't need to. She stood up, her small frame casting a long shadow across the board. She turned to her mother, who was standing a few feet away, her hands pressed against her mouth, tears streaming down her face. These weren't the tears of a woman who had been humiliated. They were the tears of a woman who had just seen the chains of a decade of servitude snap in a single night. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice clear and resonant. "Pack your things. We aren't staying for the rest of the party." Henry looked up, his face a ghostly mask of ruin. You can't be serious. That contract, it was a provocation. It's not how things are done." Sarah leaned over the table, her eyes locking onto his with a cold, final clarity. It's exactly how things are done when you underestimate the people who clean up after you, Mr. Glover. You thought the board was yours because you bought the table. My grandfather taught me that the board belongs to whoever sees the truth of it. And the truth is, you've been in checkmate since the moment you stepped into this kitchen. She reached out and picked up the blue river stone, her queen, tucking it into the pocket of her hoodie. She didn't want his marble pieces. She didn't want his mahogany table. She had taken the only thing that mattered, his power. As the crowd surged around the table, some trying to shake Sarah's hand, others filming the broken CEO, Sarah took Denise's arm. They walked through the center of the ballroom, the elite parting for them like the Red Sea. The shadow girl was gone. In her place was a giant, walking toward a future where no one would ever dare to tell her mother to stay out of the way again. Behind them, the king sat alone among his marble ruins, realizing that in his quest to own everything, he had lost the only thing he couldn't buy back, his dignity. The heavy oak doors of the Glover estate swung open, but this time there was no biometric scan, no deferential bowing of the head, and no quiet slipping through the service entrance. Sarah and Denise walked through the main foyer, their footsteps echoing against the marble like a rhythmic declaration of independence. Denise carried only a small leather bag containing her personal belongings, the few things that hadn't been provided by the estate, while Sarah clutched her cigar box of river stones and the signed contract. The cool night air hit their faces, smelling of rain and asphalt, a sharp, cleansing contrast to the stagnant scent of lemon oil and ego they were leaving behind. As they reached the end of the long, winding driveway, Denise stopped and looked back at the towering glass and stone fortress. For 10 years, those walls had been her world, a place where her value was measured in the shine of a floor and the silence of her presence. She felt a phantom weight lift from her shoulders, a physical lightness that made her breath hitch. She looked down at Sarah, who was staring straight ahead at the city lights, her face set in that same expression of calm, terrifying focus she had worn at the board. "We don't have a place to go tonight, Sarah," Denise whispered, the reality of their sudden flight beginning to settle in. "Yes, we do," Sarah replied, tapping the pocket where the contract Saturday. "Julian Vane's assistant gave me a card. He said the legal team at his firm will handle the enforcement of the wager. He's already arranged a suite for us at the Regency. He called it an investment in the future of the game." They didn't look back again. They walked toward the iron gates, which slid open automatically, sensing their departure. To the world, they were just two figures walking toward a bus stop, but in the history of the Glover estate, they were the only two people who had ever truly won. 6 months later, the atmosphere was entirely different. The air was pressurized, but not with the cruelty of a billionaire's whim. It was the high-frequency hum of 1,000 ticking clocks and the hushed, reverent whispers of the world's elite chess community. The grand ballroom of the Hilton was a sea of 6 to 4 square boards, but only one table sat on the elevated stage, bathed in a single, brilliant spotlight. Sarah Bryant sat in a high-backed ergonomic chair that finally fit her small frame. She wasn't wearing a faded navy hoodie anymore. She wore a sharp, charcoal blazer over a crisp white shirt, her hair braided back in intricate, clean lines. Across from her sat a Grandmaster twice her age, a man who had spent his life studying the very books Sarah had once simulated in her head while scrubbing baseboards. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't leaning back in bored superiority. He was hunched over the board, his face pale, his eyes darting frantically across the pieces as he realized his defensive structure was being systematically dismantled by a ghost. In the front row of the spectator gallery, Denise sat with her back perfectly straight. She was no longer wearing a domestic uniform. She wore a soft emerald dress and carried a tablet filled with notes for her first semester business law classes. She wasn't looking at the board. She still didn't quite understand the complexity of the Sicilian defense. But she was looking at her daughter. She saw the way the cameras hovered around the stage, the way the commentators spoke Sarah's name with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The shadow girl was gone. In her place was a national sensation, the girl who had emerged from a Silicon Valley laundry room to become the most talked-about prodigy in the history of the sport. The viral video of the 5-move execution had turned Sarah into a symbol of a rising class, a reminder that genius doesn't have a zip code and talent doesn't require a pedigree. Sarah reached out, her fingers closing around her queen, the same blue river stone she had kept as a reminder of where she came from. She placed it on the board with a soft, definitive thud. "Checkmate," the moderator announced, his voice amplified through the speakers. The room didn't just applaud, they stood. The sound was a tidal wave, a roar of recognition for the girl who had mastered the art of being seen. Sarah stood up and shook her opponent's hand with a grace that made the man nod in genuine respect. As the flashes of 100 cameras strobed like lightning, Sarah's eyes found her mother in the crowd. Denise was smiling, a radiant, unburdened expression that Sarah had only ever seen in her dreams. The contract with Henry Glover had been settled out of court for a sum that ensured they would never want for anything again. But the money wasn't the victory. The victory was the way Denise held her head. The victory was the way Sarah could finally breathe without checking the shadows. As Sarah walked off the stage, a reporter thrust a microphone toward her. "Sarah, they're calling you the janitor's queen. They're saying you're the most dangerous player in the world. What's your secret? How do you see the moves no one else sees?" Sarah paused, looking directly into the lens of the camera, her reflection clear and bright in the glass. She thought of her grandfather's weathered hands on a park bench. She thought of the cardboard board and the smell of bleach. She thought of the man who had laughed at her mother and lost his world in 5 moves. "I don't have a secret," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear, reaching every corner of the room. "I just stopped playing the game they wanted me to play. I started playing the one that was always mine." She took her mother's hand, and together they walked through the lobby, no longer invisible, no longer quiet, and never again underestimated. The board was clear, the king was gone, and for Sarah Bryant, the real game had only just begun.